Chapter 27, The Funeral. It was one of the wettest summers in Kansas history, the kind they could have used back in the 1850s or 1930s. But the farmers who begged for water in the spring were now bailing it out of their wheat fields before the harvest rotted. Dr. Baxi, the crooner, came out of an energetic storm to give Dana and her family the final results of his study on Lisbeth Charles. Dana's mother took his raincoat and hung it over the bathtub, and Dr. Baxi sat in the front room in his stocking feet while his boots dried. How is Save Wolcott Castle coming, Jeffrey? Well, we're hoping to raise $100,000 at the 4th of July party. We'll either have 1,000 people there or 25. Could go either way. I'd gladly hit you up for a donation, but I'm sure you're here for another reason. Yes, the remains. So, Lisbeth Charles was reduced to the status of remains. How demoralizing. He wouldn't feel that way when she gave him the journal, Dana thought. It's generous of you to share the results with us, Puner, her mother said. Dana found the subject, and she was there at the initial examination, and I thought you might all like to know what we've confirmed before the report is released to the press tomorrow. So I think it was nice of Dr. Baxi to tell them first, since the skeleton was in their house. Don't you think?
Yeah.
Raindrops came down the chimney and splattered on the fireplace grate as Dr. Baxi began his explanation. We've ground up bone fragments, put them in liquid solution, and run them through the gas chromatograph and mass spectrometer. His accent made it difficult for Dana to figure out just what these technological wonders really were, but she said, "Sounds impressive. I guess you learned a lot?" "Not so much," he said sadly. "We know the subject wasn't poisoned, nor did she die of any sort of drug ingestion." Dana's mother said, "Well, aren't we relieved to know she wasn't a junkie 135 years ago?" Also, Dr. Baxi continued, We know she died in the winter because very cold conditions would retard the putrefaction, and there were actually patches of tissue internally protected by the large mass bones. I surmise that the cold weather preserved her somewhat, and that there followed a very dry spring that partially mummified her remains. Lisbeth Charles was a mummy? Didn't that go out of style in King Tut's time? Dana's father asked. Then what did she die of? Well, it is more productive to say what she didn't die of. There is no evidence of a gunshot wound, no place where a knife penetrated the bone or a blunt object cracking a bone. Obviously, there was no fire in the room. Well, couldn't she have died of a fire first and then been dragged into the room, asked Dana. Dr. Baxi stroked his chin. Possible, but not likely. Judging by the arrangement of the bones, she died in that bed. And I submit that she wasn't in a raging fire anywhere, because her bones are in good condition. You know, it's not unusual for a skull to literally burst outward from the intensity of heat in a fire. Oh, that's terrible, Dana's mother cried. Nor could we prove smoke inhalation without any lung tissue to examine. Dana's father said, but she could have died of smoke inhalation maybe during Quantrill's raid on Lawrence in 1863. Dr. Baxi shook his head. No, Simon Fletcher, the forensic anthropologist, places her death somewhere between 1855 and 1860. Definitely pre-Civil War. But when his graduate students studied the climatic conditions of this period, they found the year I was looking for in terms of her degree of preservation. This is an intensely cold winter, followed by a very dry spring. I'd say she died in the winter of 1856, which is the very year that we're reading about when we go back in time. So we're getting close to her death when we go back. Dana was getting confused with all the technological detail. She just wanted the bottom line. Well then, how did she die? Natural causes. What? How boring, her mother said. But then she added, the poor thing was only about 20 years old. Why would she die of natural causes? Well, I don't necessarily mean heart degeneration or any such thing. It is my hypothesis that she died from a natural progression of disease such as cholera. The grad student suggests this as a possibility, although the cholera epidemic passed through about 10 years before the subject died. Malaria is another possibility, or yellow fever, smallpox, or even simple pneumonia. These were not easy times in your country. Dana thought about Millicent Weaver saying these are troubling times and worrying that she'd never get back to see Caleb or James again. Did she? But it sounds like you have a different theory, Pooner. Care to share it? Hypothesis, you understand, Jeffrey. I'm sticking my neck out, but it's a very short neck. Still, based on the research period, I submit that the young lady died of typhoid fever. Just what Jeep said, before or after she got to the room. Well, I'd say she died in the room, but now you're talking speculation, Dr. Baxley said thoughtfully, or conjecture, whichever you'd prefer. But what else did they have? They couldn't take a giant leap back in history and live out Lisbeth's last days. Dana called Mike and Derek, Sally and Anna, and of course Jeep. I'm canceling the pact, she told each of them. Lisbeth Charles is back, and we're putting her to rest. Just after dinner, they met outside Lisbeth's room. Dana said, "This is her funeral." "Funeral? We need some good sappy music," said Derek. "No, just our voices," Dana decided. She knew how she wanted to do this, and they were just going to have to go along with it all, or she'd do it alone. She led them past the barricades into the little room where Lisbeth had spent her last hours. She put a candle in the center of the room and sat down on the rough floor. They all solemnly followed. Holding hands, they formed a tight circle, and the only light was the candlelight, which made the corners of the small room seem like nests of secrets, which is a very good simile. And they talked about everyone they'd ever cared about who died. "When I was 3, my turtle, Shell Shock," said Mike, and Sally, "my great-grandmother was so old she couldn't even," and Derek, "Jim Morrison drugged himself to death. Idiotic." On, "My parents, both the same night," because remember On's parents died. Dana, President Kennedy, and Jeep, Ms. Lisbeth Charles.